Well, thanks everybody for being here. This is the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have, and it is my honor to introduce Bill Forsythe. Bill is the first executive director, the founding executive director of Foothill Transit, and as I was looking at the various pictures that we were just reviewing, Bill, you and I have known each other for 20 plus years.
Yes.
Which is quite remarkable when I look back on that. And Bill has been a friend, he's been a mentor. I've learned so much from him. And what we're going to do today is really talk about the history. I know a lot about the history of this organization, but Bill takes us back even further in terms of some of those early days and some of the excitement that came into the creation of what is now Foothill Transit. But even before that, Bill, you had a very interesting career that led you to this. Share a little bit with us about the things you were doing before you came to Foothill Transit.
I graduated from Azusa Pacific College, then, now university, back in 1974, and got my MBA at Claremont University, Claremont Graduate School under Peter Drucker, and got a call one day. I stayed on at APU, Azusa Pacific, was director of facilities, the physical plant. Got a call one day as a recruiting call that UCLA was looking for a director of transportation, and I applied for and won that job. Was at UCLA for 5 years, did a lot of fun things. We moved the football games from the Coliseum to the Rose Bowl in the early 80s, and we wanted to run transportation and parking differently than the New Year's Day game. So we set up some shuttles and did some other things for the benefit of the season ticket holders and to help traffic flow. Built 5 parking structures and financed them, raised parking fees to the faculty for the first time in 11 years.
Shocking.
Didn't make me real popular then. But I got a call after that, and the Olympics was in town, and I ended up being director of transportation for the '84 Olympics. Both as a part of UCLA and the Olympic Games, had a lot of interaction with the MTA. It was called the RTD back in those days. There was a separation. The RTD was the operations entity for the MTA, and the County Transportation Commission was the funding and oversight agency. Worked extensively with both of those. Did a lot of service to the bus service to the UCLA campus for students, faculty, and staff. Expanded service. We had 6 municipal operators that served UCLA. So I had quite a bit of knowledge about transit in Southern California at the time. So the Olympics ended successfully.
Now, were you working at UCLA and for the Olympic Committee,
No.
or did you actually leave it?
I left
You left
UCLA. A lot of people took a leave of absence intending
Wow.
to go back. I did not. So I took the highest risk job other than security
Wow.
and tickets for the Olympics with transportation. Guaranteed unemployment in a year and a half. And I didn't believe that I could operate in good faith and negotiate for the Olympic Committee against UCLA if I still had ties there that would lead me back. Would be a conflict of interest.
Okay.
So I left UCLA and didn't really know what I was going to do after the Olympics.
So risk-taking is a little bit of your DNA.
Just a bit.
Just a bit, okay.
Yeah.
I've noticed that over the years.
Yeah, calculated risk-taking.
Okay, fair enough.
Try to do what you know you can do and work the odds in your favor a bit.
Cool.
But yeah, I was interested in helping to make the Olympics a success from a transportation standpoint. Not too many people believed it could be done. I did believe it could be done because we had changed season ticket holders' behavior by moving them to the Rose Bowl and getting them to ride in buses.
Yeah.
And so we had some idea of both the carrot and the stick of what to do with changing people's commuting patterns. The Olympics was a wonderful event, a little longer than 2 weeks. We did some things there that couldn't be continued beyond the Olympics. We did some things that could have been, but the politics and the environment wasn't conducive to making that a long-term
If I remember,
solution.
the part of the buzz for those Olympics was how successful the transportation program was. That we didn't think that Southern Californians would really change their behavior, and yet They did.
We got them to. We got people to get out of their cars into buses to go to the Olympics to a larger extent than most people believed was possible. We also did a lot of other things, like getting people to work flex hours, getting trucks to deliver between midnight and 6. You can't extend that in neighborhoods at grocery stores to, having trucks bang their freight in their doors at 3 in the morning. That doesn't work. But there were some things that we did that were very successful. We actually had 7% more traffic on the freeways in Southern California every day during the Olympics than normal, and had no congestion anywhere.
Wow.
It was fun.
It's big stuff.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. So the Olympics end, and you're unemployed.
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, so what happens next?
Well, I started a company. Decided to be entrepreneurial. I had a friend that was a traffic engineer that offered me the use of his offices, his resources and facilities, offered me a job if I wanted it, but he really thought that I should go off on my own. So I had some encouragement and some support. And the RTD announced that they were going to do two things. They were going to drop a significant amount of the bus service in the San Gabriel Valley,
Right.
and they were going to double the bus fare for all of Southern California at the same time.
Yeah.
The county supervisor at the time was Pete Shabaram, that served the San Gabriel Valley, and he got on the news and announced that he was going to find a way to legally secede his 1/5 of Los Angeles County from the RTD, since they were decimating his bus service in the area that he represented and having a significant impact on his residents.
And back in the day, Supervisor Shabaram really had the entire San Gabriel Valley in terms of the way the supervisorial districts
Pretty
laid
much.
out.
There was some on the west side that he didn't have. Pasadena was not in
Okay.
his.
Okay.
But he had the predominant geography of the San Gabriel Valley.
So he was really a driving force in terms of the policy.
He was. He was also chairman of the County Board of Supervisors at the
Okay.
time.
Okay.
And they had a conservative majority at that time, and he was very conservative. So I called his chief deputy, Mike Lewis, and said Mike had been the president or the chairman of the RTD board during the Olympics, and I'd worked with him.
Okay.
And I said, Mike, if Pete is just trying to get press or send a message, I understand that. But if you're serious about doing this, I've worked with the RTD through UCLA through the Olympics. We know what is wrong there, how to set it up differently, and how to make it work better. And so my company, which meant me, was...
I was going to say, that was Forsythe and Associates, right?
Yes.
So who were the associates?
We had some people that we worked with.
Okay.
I had one employee.
Okay.
And just a bunch of associates that were willing to work with us. The consulting team was put together with Parsons, Brinker, Hoff, Quaid, and Douglas, Patty Post and Associates, and a few other consultants. And we were engaged to design Foothill Transit
Okay.
and to present the design of Foothill Transit to the County Board of Supervisors and to the cities in the San Gabriel Valley, and see if they were interested in taking over the bus service. In the interim, we got a grant to continue some bus lines that were going to be dropped at the time. So Los Angeles County picked those up as a transition to Foothill Transit. And we were off and running.
Wow. It's amazing how one thing can link to the next, and ultimately you find yourself
It is.
at the beginning of what became this organization.
Yes.
Quite remarkable. So it sounds like it was a piece of cake, nothing to it. You went to the cities and they all signed on, and it was all good, right?
Well, Supervisor Shabaram was instrumental in getting this moving. He assigned Mike Lewis to be his representative on a steering committee for the oversight of our consulting work. Don McMillan, mayor of Belmonte at the time,
Okay.
and Judy Wright, the mayor of Claremont,
Yes.
were selected by the League of Cities, or I guess it was the League, to be the city representatives. And our consulting team worked with them, presented ideas to them, presented the data to them, looked at the finances, and orchestrated the governance structure with them for how Foothill was organized, which was unique at the time.
Yeah.
Nothing else had the same kind of a structure of a governing board and an executive board from that actually met every month and made the operating decisions. So it was quite a struggle. The RTD's unions weren't thrilled that the jobs were being taken from them. but we really put some thought into how to structure the transition. So we structured the implementation of transition of bus lines so that the loss of jobs at the RTD was significantly less than their annual turnover rate. The union contracts did not go with the buses or the lines. We didn't take buses from the RTD. We bought all new buses. And we structured it so that it would minimize the impact on anyone's job at the RTD. And they still didn't care for it because the union was losing some power in that.
Sure.
They sued, so we went to the California Supreme Court in the process of appeals, and Foothill Transit won all the way around.
Well, that was a journey in and of itself to get to the point where you'd completed that lawsuit. Now, as you started all of this, was there a mechanism in place that allowed for the creation of this entity, or did you have to do some policy work at a regional level to even allow Foothill to be formed?
Both. There were laws on the books that allowed for cities to take responsibility in a new governance organization, new structure, from the RTD at the time, but under certain circumstances and conditions. So we had to follow those guidelines that were legislatively enabled. But we also had to go to each city and ask them to vote as a city council to participate in the formation of Foothill Transit. First, to agree to the study, and then later, when we had the agency ready to go, they had to agree during city council election times, which is a little tough, as you know, to get elected officials to take risk during election times. But they did agree to take responsibility for it. So the County Transportation Commission oversaw the whole process, and as there was a split between the operating entity of the RTD and the funding and controlling entity of the LACTC, the County Transportation Commission had a lot to say about it. So we had to satisfy their requirements as well as the requirements of the law, as well as all the cities and the county supervisors to make this work.
Bill, you were telling us about the cities coming on board with the JPA. How many cities originally signed on to the Foothill Transit Joint Powers Authority?
21 cities initially signed up. We had solicited 24 cities. The cities that chose not to participate initially included La Puente. Charlie Storing was a city council member at La Puente and was the San Gabriel Valley's representative on the RTD board of directors. So that was not unanticipated.
So you really had kind of an island there with La Puente and everybody else around ultimately signing on.
Yes, but we had to make assurances that we would not disrupt service in La Puente or through La Puente because of that.
Sure.
So while they had no seat at the table of the governing board, they had protection for their bus service with Foothill being formed. And then Pasadena also chose not to participate. And that actually changed the structure of what we were proposing. Initially, we'd proposed lines that ran through and were included in Pasadena, and we had to drop those because of the rules governing how you make lines eligible for transfer to a transit zone.
So that really had an impact on the size of the ultimate organization.
It did, the initial size.
The initial size.
I understand that Pasadena has since joined Foothill Transit.
Well, yeah, which is great. We're glad to have them. The challenge is that the zone rules that were in place when Foothill was created, while they're still in place, there's been so much evolution with the way that service is being offered. The rules, while they're on the books, they really don't apply.
Yeah.
So that Pasadena service that you envisioned, it didn't transfer then, and it still hasn't transferred over, and whether it will in the future is anybody's guess.
Okay. Well, that did take a considerable amount of extra time to try to accommodate Pasadena. They chose not to join, and so the 21 cities that did choose to join voted to create the entity of Foothill Transit and to accept responsibility for the governance of it. So we had a start at the structure of Foothill, but because the unions had filed a lawsuit, the judge issued, it was a Superior Court judge in downtown Los Angeles. His father had immigrated from Russia to Los Angeles, and his occupation was to organize garment workers into unions.
Okay.
The judge had heavy union sensitivities, and he issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting Foothill Transit from being implemented.
So catch us up on the timeline. So you left the Olympics in 84. You started working on the creation of Foothill shortly thereafter, 85?
85.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how long did it take to get the cities to sign on to...
We actually got the cities to sign on in 86,
Okay.
but the implementation was delayed
Right.
until we went through the legal process, and we had to go through the Superior Court. And while the judge issued the injunction stating that I'm issuing the injunction because obviously the unions are going to win this lawsuit, he had to rule in favor of Foothill Transit on every count. There was nothing that he ruled in favor of the unions. We had accommodated every one of their work rules. We had accommodated the process of transitioning lines. We had accommodated the job loss that was the fear in terms of the length of time that we implemented the transition. So we did everything that we could to make this as smooth as possible and set it up in the correct way. So we actually started full operation of Foothill Transit in 1988, which is 25 years ago.
25 years. So is this really our 25th anniversary or not? Because it depends on...
Of course it is.
When you... Okay.
Pick,
Pick a day?
pick your date that is significant. I think the most significant is the full implementation, full transfer of all the service.
Which was December...
88, I believe.
Yeah, do you remember the day? I don't, but...
I do not.
Okay. I know it's December of 88. It's somewhere around now.
It
Literally.
is. It is
Yeah.
around now. I
Okay.
was thinking the 19th, but I would have to look back at the records to make sure.
We could check that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So we're literally right to the day at that 25th mile marker.
Now, we've skipped over a lot of territory because there was a lot of discussion at each city council in the San Gabriel Valley
Sure.
about whether they would join or not. Some cities have a higher percentage of their residents and their citizens who are members of unions, and the unions were at the RTD were trying to claim that we were anti-union, that we were trying to destroy the unions, which Supervisor Shabaram had some tendencies to try to run over the unions anytime he could. But we really were not anti-union. We had no preference as to whether the contractors winning the contracts to operate Foothill Transit buses had a union or not. That was the individual company and their employees' decision, and we did not interfere with that in any way. So we actually operated, initially the contractors that came in did not have unions. Ultimately their employees organized.
Right.
It has not had a negative effect, and we said it would not have a negative effect. One of the side notes that was kind of something that I'm proud of, the president of the drivers union, the UTU, lived in Glendora.
Which is where you lived.
Which is where I lived.
Okay.
After all the lawsuits were over and we fully implemented Foothill Transit and got it going, I went to him and asked for a letter of reference.
Wow.
Because my company, Forsythe and Associates, had begun to bid on operating contracts outside of Southern California, certainly away from Foothill Transit. We would not be the referee and the quarterback in the same game.
Sure.
But we were bidding to operate contracts, Redding, California, the Phoenix metropolitan area. And he wrote a wonderful letter of reference for me.
Wow.
That I have cherished
Wow.
my entire career.
That's quite amazing.
And it said that his union was on record as being adamantly opposed to the privatization of public jobs. However, Forsythe and Associates had always dealt with him in an honest and straightforward way and ran a good operation.
That's quite an accomplishment.
And I was proud of that.
Yeah. Good. Now, you when you and I chatted on the phone a little while back, you'd mentioned some tense moments as that ratification process was going forward, and some interesting times that you lived through.
There
related to that?
were tense moments. South El Monte was a city that was heavily industrial in its residential makeup, and the union chose to send about 50 bus drivers to the city council meeting at South El Monte. And it became rather tense South Lamonti actually voted to join Foothill Transit. After that vote, I walked out to my car and was followed by about 50 RTD bus drivers.
Wow.
Who were writing down my license plate and making note of the make and model of my car. So for a number of years after that, I did not get in my car to start it. I always stood outside the car.
Wow.
anticipating
That's dedication.
anticipating some event that might have occurred. I also had some personal threats to my family and my kids
Wow.
that happened through that. But thank the Lord, nothing happened that followed up from that.
Wow.
But it did make an interesting situation.
Yeah.
Rather intense negotiation.
I can well imagine. Yeah, very challenging. So as you got through the lawsuit,
Mm-hmm.
you'd established the JPA, the board was in place. Once service started rolling, what were some of your goals related to how Foothill Transit might be different than the type of service that had been delivered here traditionally?
One of the things that has been the hallmark of Foothill Transit from the early days, and I believe has continued throughout, is that we tried not to make the bus service efficient the way most transit systems define efficiency. We wanted to make the service effective from a customer standpoint. So our focus was never on making the bus system as efficient as it could be. Making a bus system efficient means that you minimize deadhead hours, you minimize the amount of time of buses without passengers, you try to route the service so that the buses keep on the schedule at the highest level. We tried to route the buses so that it served the people that wanted to ride in the highest degree possible within the resources we had. An example is that when we made one of our early service changes, we had bus service that was running, as I recall, it was every 45 minutes, express bus service. And we changed the schedule so that it ran every 30 minutes. And ridership dropped. We thought, that's strange.
Yeah.
The typical large transit system reaction when ridership drops is to reduce service, to match the apparent demand.
Sure.
Instead, we sent teams of our operating staff, our supervisor staff, hired some college kids, and sent people out with a survey to ride the buses and to ask the people on the bus, did you have friends that used to ride with you that no longer do? And the answer traditionally was yes. We said, why don't they ride anymore? Do you know? Can we go talk to them? Well, we found out through that process of asking the customers what was wrong, that the transfer points at the 45-minute schedule had allowed people to walk from one bus essentially to another with minimal dwell time on the curb. The schedule change that we implemented significantly increased the amount of time they were waiting for their transfer bus. So instead of cutting schedule, cutting bus service, which would be traditional to make it more efficient, we actually added more buses and more service on those transfer routes so that we timed the transfer points much better.
Okay.
So we learned something from that.
Sure.
But the critical aspect was asking the customer, what do you like? What are we doing wrong? What are we doing right? We did a lot of that early on. We had a lot of people on buses talking to people and recording their answers. And that has been a hallmark of Foothill Transit. It's a customer-focused system, not an internally system-focused business. And we think that's been a hallmark of its success through the years. So that's one of the things that I think really set Foothill apart separately. Another aspect that was different was the design of the actual buses. At the time, in the mid-1980s, the color scheme of most large transit systems was to get brown and dark orange, burnt orange colors inside
Sort
the
of
bus.
the color of dirt.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, all right.
And we put a very bright, brilliant white scheme, very light and airy interior colors, light gray or silver, very light pastel blue with a white window pane grid. And when we did that, we went up to the manufacturing facility and actually took swaths of the materials and the side panels and the flooring inside a bus to see how that's going to look inside the buses in daylight, at night, with the tint of the windows and all the different aspects. And the manufacturer said, nobody else does this. They say that the bus is going to just look filthy. And we said, no, actually, the buses will look clean because they will be clean. The colors that you have from other agencies are simply hiding their dirt or trying to, and they don't do a good job of it. So the buses are always dirty. So we changed the mentality. In the mid-1980s in Los Angeles, most buses had a lot of graffiti. On the paint, on the windows, you could barely see out.
Including the buses that were operating here in the San Gabriel Valley.
Especially the buses that were operating here in the San Gabriel Valley. We had a term in our contract for the operations contracts that required every bus to leave the yard graffiti-free every day. And there was a financial penalty to the contractor if they allowed a bus to leave the yard with graffiti noticeable on the bus. And we had people out inspecting that.
And that was in the very first operating contract.
Absolutely.
And it survives today.
Yes. So the difference in the mentality of the customers was remarkable. We had one incident that was very memorable to me. We had a young man who was tagging the inside of the back of a bus with graffiti. And the bus driver stopped the bus. It called it in for a police report. The young man saw that he might have some issue with the police, popped the emergency exit window on the bus and jumped out.
Wow.
5 other passengers, customers, jumped out and went after him and tackled him and held him for the police.
Oh, gee. Okay.
And it sent a strong message that this is my bus from the customer perspective. You're not going to damage what I have to live in and what I have to commute to work in every day.
It's a real sense of ownership amongst that customer group.
Very real sense of ownership among the customers. So that was a wonderful side effect of putting buses in that were clean. The board also made a decision not to have any exterior advertising on the buses. And the RTD folks said, you're just giving up dollars. Why would you do that? And we had the impression, and I don't know if that continues, but we believed at the time that advertising simply was a form of graffiti and promulgated additional graffiti by the graffiti artist. So the revenue from the advertising on the exterior of the buses was not received, but in exchange, the ridership just skyrocketed. Yeah. So we made more money from increased ridership than we lost in advertising.
Well, and that does continue today. In fact, our heritage is such that the board has continued to reaffirm that we don't put advertising on the exterior. Our new livery design that we're unveiling now provides no space for it. And so the foundation that you set back in those early days, it lives on 25 years later.
That's great. I still believe that advertising is graffiti on the outside of a bus.
Sure.
So I'm delighted to hear that tradition continues.
Yeah, it's remarkable when I think about some of the things that were done early on, being very innovative, that really have stood the test of time. Did you have any notion that would be the case, or what in those early days, as you're trying all these different things, what was your thought process behind some of that?
Yeah, we really did believe that Foothill Transit would stand the test of time. That the concepts that we were putting in, which were innovative, 25 years ago, made sense from the overall customer service and effective bus service concept, rather than the efficient bus service, which doesn't meet people's needs. Right. Personally, I've had a number of wonderful mentors in my life and my career. I had the great fortune to study under Peter Drucker directly at Claremont Graduate School for a fourth of my graduate courses. Wow. He beat into my head, understand who your customer is and what business you're in. Yeah. And we defined the Foothill Transit service as being in the business of providing transportation for the residents of the San Gabriel Valley where they wanted to go in the most effective way that we could at a reasonable cost. So while we weren't the lowest cost bus service around, our higher priced express service had the highest amount of growth because we stepped up the level of service offered to the commuters going into downtown Los Angeles especially.
So the primary driver was quality as much as anything else.
Absolutely. Quality was paramount. And as you know, the operating contracts were written to maintain the quality. We had some hiccups early on. We had one particular contractor that believed, for whatever reason, that we would be embarrassed to have a public acknowledgement that they weren't delivering the quality that they promised to deliver. And they got a very rude awakening to that when the executive board called an emergency meeting for the purpose of terminating their contract and capturing their performance bond if there were any cost increase for a new contractor to replace them.
Wow. And when did that happen? That had to be pretty early.
It was fairly early.
Yeah.
That company's no longer in business.
Okay.
They sold to Laidlaw, who sold to First. There's a long history there. But this was a small school bus company that also operated charter bus service, and they had some of our express bus service. And we gave them an amount of time to clean the graffiti off the buses that they'd allowed to build up. We kept telling them and finding them on a minor scale for allowing graffiti on the buses. They didn't fix the problem, and the buses were dirty. And we went out and inspected the entire fleet. We gave them 30 days to correct the problems. They really didn't do anything within the 30 days. They thought we were bluffing.
Yeah.
And they found out when the executive board agreed to have an emergency session for the purpose of terminating their contract that we weren't afraid of the press.
Wow.
That we thought we would be better served by going public, that we have standards and we're enforcing the standards, and we're not going to accept someone who had promised to agree to those standards at a fixed price to then slack off. So the customers seem to have appreciated that.
So you
right?
ultimately did make a change.
We ultimately made a change, but it
But
was at a
not
contract
directly-
term. We didn't. The board did not terminate the contract at that meeting. Okay. We held the emergency meeting to let them know that it was not a bluff,
Yeah.
and that we invited the press, and they did make a significant change in the quality of the service that they provided.
Wow.
They didn't make a big enough change to be able to win the contract renewal. They believed that a low price would win us instead of the high quality, and we told them that wouldn't work.
Wow. Interesting.
So we set the standards, we enforced the standards, we made sure that the standards were geared toward customer service and high quality, and that has been a winning combination for Foothill Transit, as you know.
Now, there was an economic component to all this, though, that came into play as well. And well, I certainly appreciate that the quality was the primary driver. What did those early economics look like in terms of what this organization was able to accomplish and do with the resources that it secured compared to what had been happening prior to that?
The cost of operating this service was exorbitant under the RTD. The routes had low productivity, very high cost. There were some provisions at that time at the RTD and the union contracts that allowed significant amounts of overtime that was not productive to the operation of the service. When we took over the contract, the lines, we had a requirement to save, as my memory serves, about 25%. We actually saved significantly more than that, to the point where we only used about half of the tax subsidy money that the RTD had been using on these lines and turned it into nearly 3 times more service. So while the bus fare was regulated and stayed constant, the ridership increase just outperformed anything else that was going on and brought in the financial impact that we could continue to expand service.
Well, I seem to recall there was a rather young consultant who helped evaluate a little bit of that early economic activity. So it's when you and I first met?
It is. Who were you working for at the time?
Ernst & Young.
Ernst & Young.
Ernst & Young, yeah.
Yeah. So you had to evaluate to see whether what we were saying in our marketing material was actually true or just blowing smoke.
Yeah.
How did you find that?
Yeah. Well, I was in, your focus on quality, it struck me as being interesting because I was so driven and so much looking at the economic component of it. The quality almost seemed like a secondary element. The economics were huge. And exactly what you referenced there, the fact that the organization was able to take the available dollars and really leverage them into more service for the community and do that with higher quality. To me, that was the winning combination that really brought this together, combined with the fact that the organization was so focused on the communities. And here, you didn't have any place to hide costs.
No.
It was all right there. You ran bus service, that's all there was.
This was the only thing we had. We didn't have any other auxiliary enterprises to throw some money around.
So it was a pretty straightforward economic analysis from the Foothill side.
It was a very straightforward economic analysis. Supervisor Mike Antonovich hired another independent consultant, a guy named Jonathan. It'll come to me in a moment.
I know who you're talking about.
British guy,
Yep.
Harvard MIT grad.
Yes.
He's done some worldwide consulting, and he's a friend on Facebook for me now. But he also did another independent economic analysis.
Okay.
Found slightly different results, but the same conclusion, that what we said we were doing is what we were actually doing.
Sure.
We were running higher quality service at a lower cost and turning all the savings back into more bus service. And that's what the Foothill Board and the governing body has always tried to do with the funds.
Yeah. Thinking of the governing board, being a joint powers authority with a wide number of policymakers who were leaders and had an impact on the organization, you certainly must have encountered a number of different personalities and a number of different approaches. Any board members that particularly stand out that you recall that helped drive the organization forward?
Oh, sure. Judy Wright was just a hero. She was the League of Cities representative for the San Gabriel Valley Association of Cities. She and Don McMillan. Don was from El Monte. Don was quieter than Judy, but a rock-solid businessman, mayor of of a significant sized town.
Big city.
And they really helped us shape. They really did shape the direction that we took on the governance side. We would bring proposals back to them, and they would trash them and tell us, that may sound good on paper, but that's not how government works. So we had some good ideas that we brought in that we had to tweak, we had to change. We really tried to find a way to set up the entire distribution of voting at the governance side. We had two fundamental concepts: that the governing board should not be able to be controlled by any group of cities, whether the group meant a size of city, large or small, or a geographic area within the San Gabriel Valley. So the second concept is that we tried to take cities that already had some natural affiliation for some other purpose, whether it was a water district or schools or some other purpose that they had, and keep them together as much as we could.
Okay.
The concept was that every city got one vote, whether they were the city of Bradbury with 800 people or the city of West Covina, which at the time I think had 105,000 people. Each got one vote on the major issues. But then the executive board that awarded contracts and conducted the monthly business had to have a balanced population, and each city in the executive board zone had to be contiguous. So you couldn't have Pomona in a zone for the executive board purposes with West Covina.
Right.
Would be the cities that were allied and had other common things in interest. It took several starts at trying to figure out that structure, and more than several proposals back to the steering committee to see what would work in their opinion. Then we went to the league and went to the San Gabriel Valley Association of Cities and threw up trial balloons, said, we're thinking about doing this or we're thinking about doing that. What do you think? What's your preference? And we would hear pros and cons on all the issues. And we came up with a wonderful system where everyone was engaged at the annual meeting on the issues that mattered to them. And those issues were, what's the budget?
Right.
What's the bus fare?
Yep.
And what major service changes are you planning? So they limited themselves to those three items beyond who's going to serve on the executive board from each of the clusters. Everything else was delegated to a 5-member executive board. One representative appointed by the county,
Right.
the 3 county supervisors that had representation, and then the other 4 members being city elected officials with a member and an alternate from each cluster of cities. And we did, as you know, try to meet with the clusters periodically and have small meetings with all the members in that cluster that wanted to come, whether they were on the executive board or an alternate or just as the representative of the city at the annual meeting. We tried to keep everyone engaged and informed about what we were planning to do, how well we were doing, and what changes we were looking at to make. And
That's still a work in progress, by the way.
Of course.
That component.
I'm not suggesting that was perfected.
Oh, no.
That's always a work in progress.
I think it was a great model, and I think it continues to work well. I think the evolution is we continue to look for ways to engage those groups based on that original model, which was very sound. And it did pull those cities together in those clusters that really made a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. City politics is very interesting.
Oh, yeah.
It's an interesting animal. The level of harmony within a city council will ebb and flow like water. A city that has wonderful cohesion among all their elected officials this year may be at each other's throats next year. When issues change, faces change, the city composition changes, whether it's economic or ethnic or whatever reason it changes. And we have seen throughout all the cities in the San Gabriel Valley that ebb and flow of real harmony versus some dissension that creeps up. That did not spill over very much at all to the business of Foothill Transit. The governance structure allowed and fostered, and the elected officials, Judy Wright, Don McMillan, Len Martins from Glendora before Bob Kuhn came on.
Wow.
These are Tom Sykes from Walnut.
Right.
We had, I know I'm missing one, Michael De La Torre from the county. We had folks that would bring their personal commitment to Foothill Transit and convey that to the cities in their cluster or to the members of their cluster in the county. And it really was a wonderful model that has worked quite well, and still continues to work well from what I see.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's remarkable how that model with all those unknowns, and it has served the test of time. And while things evolve and grow and change, really, if you look at the core of the DNA, it goes back to those early days.
It was not easy to structure. It was even less easy to explain.
Yeah.
Because I remember trying to develop how they will meet and what the annual meeting looks like was horribly convoluted to members that were just used to calling roll and voting on things.
Right.
Because we had to have the full governing board meet and then adjourn to the executive board and then adjourn back to it was a back and forth play, but it worked actually very, very well.
Yeah. Amazing. You've had a chance to interact with the organization over the years,
Mm-hmm.
and spent a little time with us earlier today. There are many things that you have your fingerprints still on. Are there things that have caught your eye that, in terms of principles or concepts or ideas that were important to you as a leader that you see in the organization now, 25 years later?
Absolutely. The innovation is clearly there. We tried to do some things technologically that weren't ready. The technology simply wasn't there in terms of communications, internet, smartphones and iPads and tablets. You've really brought that along. The commitment to the look and the quality of the buses and the facilities is just really heartwarming to me. I like it. If you are responsible for the initial design of something, it's hard to see that change because there's some pride of ownership or authorship with that. I'm delighted with what you've done with the look of the fleet, with the livery of the new bus look that you have, emphasizing the green aspect, emphasizing the energy efficiency. I've had a chance to tour your facilities when I was trying to bid on operating contracts in other companies, and they're impressive. The design has carried through the quality that Foothill was established with. I'm very pleased with that. I also see among the staff here at your offices a fire in the eyes. I see a fire in the belly. I see the energy and the pride that these folks have that conveys just through conversation, through banter, through, I had a chance to sit in a board presentation rehearsal, and the quality is really there. You've maintained that sets Foothill Transit, I think, apart from many other transit systems that I've seen.
Well, I think it's that commitment to quality. And if there's anything I think of in terms of there's so many aspects of your legacy here, but that commitment to quality, that commitment to excellence, that commitment to community, to me, those are the things that you should be very proud of, because those were the values that you instilled in the organization early on that continue to live with us today.
One of the things that encourages me with Foothill Transit very, very much is that I believe that corporate America and perhaps corporate world hears that, the quality is important and you should do quality, and you should do things right, and you should do things for customers. And that's at the motto level. But when it comes down to every day, they cut cost for the bottom line of the profit of today. And Foothill Transit has proven what we held when we first started it, that if you do things right, it really does work. And it works better, and it improves the lives of people. And you can do it with significant economic savings at the same time. So it's not an either-or question. So Foothill Transit has not made short-term decisions to save resources or to cut cost that would impact the communities negatively, the employees negatively. They've really held the standard to me, and I commend you for doing that as the executive director and the board for making sure that
it's the whole organization that's rallied behind that, and continue to focus on that quality in terms of delivery of service. So how long did you serve as executive director?
You're taking me back.
It's a test. Yeah,
it is a test. As I recall, I was the executive. We moved from consultant to a management role when Foothill Transit actually became operational. The executive board voted to ask our company to make that transition on a sole source basis because we had all the history of how it was developed and what it should be, and they wanted to hold our feet to the fire to see if it would really work. So I was the initial executive director on a part-time basis under that first contract.
Okay.
That was before the full implementation of Foothill Transit.
Okay.
Once it was fully implemented, I remained on as executive director, I believe until about 89.
So really for about a year.
A year and a half, 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That's my memory.
I'm not.
I brought on Roger Chapin, who had worked for ATE, now First Transit. He was the operations manager at one of the early contracts.
Right.
And he came in and under the title of assistant or deputy executive director,
Right.
with the intent to transition me out as the board was comfortable. And that's what we did.
Okay. Wow. And then you've really had a role in shaping several of us who have followed you, because you hired Roger.
Hired Roger.
And Roger then became executive director, but you were still the chief executive officer of Forsythe and Associates, so
Yes.
you still had a hand in
Oh, yes.
what was happening.
Yeah, we had a fairly long and smooth transition as Roger became more involved in the the monthly operations and running the board meetings. I would attend, but withdraw, let him make the presentations. If asked a question, I would respond or help as needed. But he really fully implemented that transition. And then he needed a deputy executive director.
Right.
The initial one was Birgit Gabig. I don't know if you remembered that.
I didn't remember that. That's right.
Birgit was the initial deputy executive director. She had been the finance person for the agency.
Right.
And she needed to make a change, actually start a family, and wanted to take some time away from work. And so we did a recruitment and hired Julie Austin as the deputy executive director and finance guru. And we did that with the intent to move her into the executive director position and transition Roger out as our company, Forsythe and Associates, bid on more operating contracts in other areas.
Sure.
So
Roger then served, you were there until 89-ish, 90, somewhere in there?
I think 90.
Okay.
Our first operating contract as a company was in 96 in Scottsdale, Arizona, Forsythe and Associates.
Right.
And by that time, Roger had transitioned out. I think he was there maybe 4 or 5 years. I can
tell you when Roger left.
Okay.
1997.
1997.
No. Yeah, 97.
Yeah.
Roger left that role in 97. I had a little vested interest in his promotion. So.
I understand. So Julie hired you.
Yes, she did.
And you came in as deputy executive director.
Yep. April 1997.
April of 1997.
In fact, Aaron Lim and I both started on the exact same day. Have got that right, Aaron? Timing? Yes. April 15th, 1997. I took a little vacation. Aaron stayed on.
Very good. And then, as I recall, you took a little hiatus and went to Tulsa.
I did.
With ATE as their transit
Actually,
executive
I
director.
worked directly for the agency there.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Oh, okay.
I worked directly for the board.
Okay.
Served in that role for 2 years, and that provided the opportunity for Kevin to step into that deputy role, and then I came back when Julie left.
Very good.
So, yeah.
So when did you take over as executive director at Foothill?
2003.
Okay. So this is 10 years.
It's 10 years plus. 10 and a half.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Congratulations.
It's been a good run.
So you've had the longest tenure of any executive director.
I have. I think Julie was second. She was 7, I think, or 8.
Yeah.
I beat her record.
Okay.
So it's a great organization, doing some great things.
Foothill's maintained the quality standards that were in the initial concept.
Well, I think it goes back, and it's great to be able to capture this early history, because much of what we do now is based on those things that started, back in 1988, and that commitment to quality, that commitment to our customers, that commitment to cleanliness, that brilliant white paint that sometimes is a real pain for our operating folks to have to maintain. But it's a demonstration of that commitment to quality that started when the organization was formed.
One of the other aspects, you asked about the economics. One of the other aspects is that when we started Foothill Transit, there was no fund for capital.
Yeah.
So the contractors had to buy the transit buses and provide them to Foothill Transit and still operate at a lower cost, including the cost of the bus, than the RTD was operating. So we had no other source for it. It took a while after Foothill was implemented before we were able to go after federal capital dollars to pay for the cost of the buses. So we structured the contracts, the operating contracts, with Embry Bus, Laidlaw, ATE, which were the initial contractors, none of which companies exist anymore. But the initial contract required them to separate the cost of capital and amortize that so that we had a guaranteed buyout price at a specific point in time, so that when we were able to qualify for federal funds, we could actually buy the buses from the contractors and not have any disruption of service.
But I remember some of those early operating locations included tents and gravel lots and...
Well, let's see.
Not quite that bad?
Well, they weren't tents. I don't recall any tents. I do recall some lots that were substandard, some facilities that were way substandard. the initial school bus facility that Embry had in Pasadena for the 495, 498 were rustic.
Yikes.
But we had a lot of fun putting this together.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that's another aspect, and I hope that's something that we're always able to hang on to. It was a lot of work back then.
Oh yeah,
but it was a lot of fun.
huge fun.
And I think that's also, if you think about our DNA, I hope that's something that we can also hang on to. We work hard, we're committed to what we do, but we try to have some fun and have a good time in doing that at the same time. And again, I think that goes back to those early days of pulling all this together and really making something that was on the verge of being impossible possible.
You know, we have to acknowledge that there were a lot of factors that fell into place to make this work. The RTD significantly helped us by announcing draconian measures
Sure.
to double the bus fare and cut the bus service. There was a conservative county supervisor that had the political power at the county at the time
Right.
to leverage some resources. There were city council members that were willing to step forward and take on this high-risk proposition and represent their fellow cities in the San Gabriel Valley. We had a lot of things happening. Our company was fortunate. I was very fortunate to be in the right place with the right experience at the Olympics and UCLA to know that we could make this work. Not having any experience actually operating public transit, but working with all the agencies that did and seeing what was wrong with the operational structure. Having an RTD separate from the LECTC. So the funding and the operations were not tied as they are now.
Right.
Makes it much harder for the agency to make major changes when it's all one big happy
Well,
family.
and in many respects, what was accomplished here then, the difficulty in trying to accomplish that again today under the current circumstances, it virtually would be impossible in many regards.
It would be another daunting task.
It would be indeed. Absolutely. Very cool. Well, why don't we pause here, Bill, and see if anybody has any questions.
Okay.
We've got a tremendous amount of history and knowledge. Anybody have a burning question they'd like to ask Bill while we've got him?
I'll throw one at
David?
Bill. When you're putting together the seats on a
Well, the question is how did cities with no bus stops or bus service become a part of Foothill Transit, and why were they allowed in? That really is a political question. There was an association of cities, and all those cities were members. They wanted to participate, and they made an argument to their fellow city council members in other neighboring cities that while they may not have any bus service running directly through their city and no bus stops, they were impacted by what happened in the bus service in the cities around them. So that Bradbury comes to mind that had no bus service. I don't know if there was another one at the time. But Bradbury made the point that they were a part of the San Gabriel Valley. They had things in common, that they needed bus service at least reasonably close to their city boundaries for people that would come to work in Bradbury, domestic help, chefs, cooks, people that performed landscape services and other physical labor types jobs that were hired to a fairly high degree in Bradbury as a percentage of the residents. So they needed service to continue for their employees to be able to get to their work, the people that lived outside their city but worked in their city. And that argument was persuasive with their fellow council members. And, probably is a legitimate reason to give them a voice. Plus, there were, as a political question, there were people who had more involvement in regional issues at that time. And they had support of other people that needed their vote on regional things that affected their cities that wouldn't necessarily be transit related. That's part of the political process, like it or not. So there were political issues at work that forced that issue to be resolved the way it was.
Given your longevity in working with public transportation, how you future of transportation being in this region?
The future of transportation in this region. When we were creating Foothill Transit in the mid-1980s, there was a very heated argument and debate on a regional level about should there be any rail service in Southern California. There was no rail service to serve commuting people. The only rail service in Southern California at the time was freight. So we had gone from the Red Line back in the 1960s that served the whole region with extensive transit systems. That went out of business. It swung the other way. There was no rail service, no light rail service, no commuter rail service, no subway or heavy rail service in Los Angeles during the '84 Olympics. Nothing. The Blue Line was the first rail service, light rail service from Long Beach to downtown Los Angeles. And I remember writing the inaugural day of service on that line. There was a heavy rail versus bus argument politically. People were arguing, should we have rail or should we have bus? And our position at Foothill Transit, and my personal position, has always been, that's not the right question. It's not either or. That's a question like have you stopped beating your wife? You need to provide a full component of transportation policies and services that meet the needs of the region as a whole. You need parking restrictions and parking rates that encourage people toward transit. You need bus service where it doesn't make sense to run rail. You need rail service where you want either have the density or you want to encourage the density for people not to have cars or drive them. So this region, as it continues to develop, back in the 80s was much more thinly spread than it is now. You've had a lot of population concentrations come in since the mid-1980s, in the last 25 years. I think you will probably continue to see that. So you need to have a continuing commitment to quality of service. You need to have a continuing commitment to fund public transit options. And I think Foothill Transit will probably end up, as rail services developed in the San Gabriel Valley, transitioning more to feeder service, as well as continuing some long-range commuter express lines. But you've got to look to see how the nature of the region is changing in population density, in job density, in residential density, and try to anticipate the real significant long-term decisions that have to be made with long-term implications and a high cost considerations to make sure that we stay up with the way Southern California is changing. So far, I've been encouraged to see that this is continuing. You're getting the Gold Line.
Yes, absolutely.
That was an important thing that we had as a hope and a dream 25 years ago. It's becoming a reality. So you have to be able to integrate what we do in the San Gabriel Valley with all of Los Angeles and beyond Los Angeles City and County, and make sure that people have the options. As jobs grow in San Bernardino County, you may have to change your focus and start moving people back the other way, more than in downtown Los Angeles, and provide continued operations and continued options for them not to drive their car. Because our air quality can't stand a lot more cars. I mean, it has worsened in the last 25 years. We got to find ways to reverse that and to make it effective for people and still contribute to the quality of their life. So land use planning issues come into that. Mixed use facilities where you have retail and office jobs and residences combined within reasonable areas, and shopping opportunities where you don't have to get in a car to go to shop for groceries or for clothes or any other aspects of what people need. So we've got to have a way to continue to have a larger picture of how Foothill Transit fits within the grand scheme of Southern California to make it vibrant and economically viable and to retain the quality of life. Because as we've said throughout this discussion, quality of life should be paramount. And quality of service is a very highly important factor that contributes to quality of life. Does that answer your question?
It totally does, thank you.
All right. Maybe one more question, then we'll kind of bring things to a close.
I can throw one more out.
David's always good for another question.
You know me, I always have questions.
You always have questions.
Most organizations and agencies that are run by boards and rules.
Well, the question is why weren't detailed bylaws put in place? Actually, they were, but we had a commitment to simplify and to de-bureaucratize the governance of this transit agency compared to the trends that we had seen before with other agencies. There is a concept called negative entropy that says that an agency will feed on itself to its own destruction. And we tried to reverse that. We tried to make this as streamlined and as simple as we possibly could and still attain the objectives and have the controls that would make sure that people weren't stealing money or absconding the resources, or that to make sure that any group of cities couldn't control the agenda to the detriment of their other cities. So we tried to do what we could to give a framework, but we also tried not to overburden it with a lot of rules that says, here's what you have to do. I know that many more rules have been put into place since I left the agency back in 2000 with the sale of my company.
They have. I think, though, that concept, and it's an important one. I'm glad you brought that up, David, because I think, again, it's one of those things that makes this organization different. And while there have been more rules that have been put in place as we've matured, I think that notion of trying to run this public agency as much like a business or as efficiently from a bureaucratic standpoint, I think that core principle that you instilled there still holds true.
And I guess, David, my experience working at UCLA for 5 years was instrumental in my own personal desire to simplify and to debureaucratize this agency. UCLA is a wonderful university. It's a large bureaucracy, and it's extremely difficult to get anything actually accomplished. It takes a long time and a lot of coordination because of the complexities, the networks, the vast extent of people that have something to gain or lose by decisions, and they've instituted so many rules that it's almost paralysis by analysis. At least it was for me when I left there, and that was back in 1983. It's hard to reverse that. So if you start out with a lot of rules, you will add many more. If you start out with a minimalist view and still make sure that you're trying to protect what needs to be protected with rules. Our approach was that you can trust people to do what's right most of the time, and that you need to have rules to correct them, find them and correct them when they abuse something that's going on, and take effective action. But the process of doing that with a group of people together, elected officials, staff, it's easier to tell them what to do in a specific circumstance if it's required by a vote or by a new rule if you have to have one, than it is to try to move the process forward when it's burdened down with so many rules that it's almost unwieldy. So that's the basic premise. Start simple. If you need a rule, it's easy to adopt. If you don't need the rule, it's almost impossible to reverse it. And that's why we started with a minimalist view of the governance structure, of the organizational documents. County Council was extremely helpful in helping to shape that, along with our other consultants. We spent a lot of time and effort and discussion just about that particular subject at the steering committee level and at the initial level of the Foothill Executive Board and the Governing Board. So we tried to do it that way rather than trying to undo something that was unwieldy later. Does that help?
Yes.
Great stuff. Well, Bill, thanks for your insights and for sharing your time with us today. I hope you're very proud of what you've accomplished here. It is truly remarkable how much of that early vision, those early concepts, those early ideas has continued to be the foundation of what this organization is all about. And as we move forward through the next 25 years, I'm certain that those elements will continue to move forward. So thank you for all that you've done.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to sit and talk about something that's had a success for 25 years.
Well, it's quite amazing. So cool.
Thank you.